Thank you, Sanjay. And may I just say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here on this panel with my former boss, Foreign Secretary K. Srinivasan. Indeed, a great pleasure to see you, sir, and to listen to your exceptionally balanced and insightful remarks. And let me say three things before I start. The first is that overall, as a concept and a concept of the region and what we are discussing over the next day and a half, I think Sanjay has done a remarkably good job. So that concept note really speaks for itself. And I would have hesitated to say too many things had my remarks been actually more or less the same as Foreign Secretary Srinivasan's, but actually they're not. So it's a coincidence that I'm going to go on a different track, and with your permission, sir. And the other thing, one more thing, yes. The third thing is that the Asia-Pacific theater in World War II comprised South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. So it's just quite befitting that when we talk about 70 years after the war, this is the Asia-Pacific which we're talking about. So I entirely agree with Sanjay's geographical delimitation of the region. Okay, here we go. Asia has enjoyed obviously remarkable economic growth over recent decades. However, 70 years after the war, it is still struggling to clear its path towards an Asian century. Some nations have faced considerable adversity, others are still to regain normal nation status, and some have enjoyed a free pass to great power status. What I propose to do is to trace the trajectory of the region and some of its powers since the end of the war. In the regional overview, I have two segments. The first is the history debates, and the second is the power flux. So, over the history debates. Now, in 1945, as we all know, Asia stood decimated by war, by European imperialism, and the consequences of Japan's disastrous effort at creating a greater Asian solidarity sphere, which morphed into Japanese imperialism. This was a historic low for Asia, leaving it at its weakest in 3 centuries. World War II, of course, ended in the collapse of the Japanese Empire, and fortunately for India and others, also led to the rapid collapse of European empires in Asia. It is not very frequently recalled, so I want to recall now that 750,000 British Indian troops played a vital role in the Allied victory over Japan, and Japan's continental march was finally stopped at Kohima and Imphal. In fact, even the Chinese nationalists were supplied from India. That this was not recognized or rewarded in post-war settlements became a historic loss for India. Today, it's clearly high time to move beyond the discourse of victors and vanquished and consider pathways to regional peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific, but this remains a work in progress. India has no history issues with Japan, and many countries in Southeast Asia have moved on as well. China and South Korea remain the main holdouts as they continue to exploit arguments over history for domestic political ends. For instance, the recent Chinese-Russian commemorations to, quote, safeguard the war outcome and the post-war international order, unquote, when their actions actually point to the reverse. This is a saga in which Asia is the loser. Continued history debates only fuel distrust and competing agendas in the region, inflame territorial disputes, and undermine efforts to achieve pragmatic diplomatic solutions. Now, a little bit about the power shift. As Foreign Secretary Srinivasan mentioned, the region is witnessing as Sanjay mentioned, actually, the region is witnessing its second major power shift since the World War, and the most significant shift in major power relations since 1991. With its unprecedented economic rise, there's no doubt that Asia lies at the heart of this ongoing flux of global power. And as it becomes the main engine of the world economy, the role and power and influence of the growing Asian economies will inevitably grow. Both the continental and the maritime domains of the Asia Pacific have already become decisively important part of the global discourse, even though they remain undervalued in geopolitical weight and geoeconomic standing. Japan's spectacular rise after the war and India's relatively modest recent rise did not generate apprehensions in the region. However, China's growing military power, together with its unilateral territorial and maritime assertions, are causing concern. So, ironically, the reprise of Asian power is giving rise to a typically Asian anxiety, and Asia, where everyone rises, remains distant. The prevailing scenario is, in fact, an exercise in international relations theory. Anxious Asian countries are hedging, balancing, bandwagoning, engaging, and aligning to secure their interests. Now, let me turn to the countries. I just mentioned 3 or 4, and I will stick to the Asian side of it as Foreign Secretary Srinivasan did. So, coming to India, there's absolutely no doubt that India's geographical location at the crossroads of Asia has defined its external engagement through history. The British Raj, in fact, exercised region-wide dominance from Malacca to Mombasa, Shanghai to Suez, from New Delhi. Post-independence India obviously does not. India's capacity to do so was severely constrained by a number of factors. I'll mention just some of them. Its arbitrarily defined borders truncated and circumscribed India, cutting it off from Western and Central Asia on one side and from its own northeast and Burma on the other. With China occupying Tibet shortly thereafter, India was hemmed in to its west and north, which remains the case even today as India faces an increasingly hostile Sino-Pak strategic alliance. The progress of India's early Asian initiatives could not be sustained beyond the 1950s. India drifted away from Indonesia after 1955, from Japan after 1960, and from the ASEAN states after 1967. Its humiliating defeat in the border war with China in 1962 hastened India's withdrawal from Asia. With its closed economic model, India was also markedly absent from the Asian economic boom of the 80s and 90s. Thus, after making a promising commitment in 1947 to lead Asian resurgence, India remained a marginal player in Asia for 3 decades from 1962 to 1992. And even within South Asia, India has faced the continuous pressure of territorial demands by China and Pakistan. It has made little headway in forging either economic integration or security convergences in its immediate neighborhood. As China increases its presence in the Indian Ocean region and India confronts a growing asymmetry of power, Russia has also now receded as a reliable source of support for India. So, not surprisingly, India's Look East orientation, launched in 1992, bolstered by its founding membership in the EAS in 2005, and upgraded to Act East in 2014, can be regarded as a major success story. From a growing emphasis on soft power and democratic values to a revival of India's historical maritime interests across the interconnected Asia-Pacific and IOR regions, India is now pursuing multi-directional engagement to secure its economic and strategic space in Asia. As India develops maritime connectivity across the IOR, including in the Bay of Bengal basin, its role as a net provider of regional security will keep pace, and I foresee that a naval breakout strategy will increasingly define India's foreign and security policy. India is also, to my mind, finally breaking free from the ideological shackles of non-alignment and its beguilingly misnamed successor, strategic autonomy. It is increasingly recognizing that truly strategic partnerships are founded on a broad convergence of interests and have the capacity to fundamentally impact the balance of power to mutual advantage. But India still needs to fully comprehend that commitments with partners have to be reciprocal and not one-sided. Coming to Japan, a little bit about Japan, it's to me a supreme irony that Japan, which led the Asian Renaissance and economic resurgence after centuries of Western domination, is still struggling to resume its existence as a normal nation. The unnatural constraints imposed on Japan after World War II have had an adverse impact on Japan and the region as a whole. Even Japan's ally, the United States, shows ambivalence. It encourages Japan to assume a greater security role, but at the same time assures China and Korea that the US-Japan alliance imposes restraints on Japanese behavior. Japan's strategic environment has remained little changed since World War II, since 1945. It has no peace treaty with Russia. It has unresolved territorial disputes, continuing criticism on history issues, calls upon its leaders not to honor the nation's war dead, not even a self-defense military. You know that the Japanese military is still called a self-defense force. Japan got a Ministry of Defense only in January 2007. Japan's predicament in Asia is astonishing when compared with trends in Europe, where past colonizers and aggressors have found comfort in the European Union. Unusually for a major power, Japan's post-war success has been built on geo-economic strength alone, and this has tended to make Japan's power and influence unidimensional, as evidenced by the painful failure of its past checkbook diplomacy. Now, obviously, altruism is not an attribute of global power politics. However, it is worth recalling that since World War II, Japan has been a model nation. Asia's growing prosperity today has been enabled by Japan's assistance, investment, and technology. I'll slightly differ with Secretary Srinivasan and say that the Flying Goose model is actually led by Japan, and China is the current inheritor of that, but the originator of that entire model was Japan. The modest steps taken by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to enable more proactive contributions to regional peace and stability are welcome for Asia's geopolitical balance. However, going forward, hopefully, going forward, Japan will be able to assume even greater responsibility for buttressing Asian security. I think India and much of the region will welcome that prospect. Turning to China, just a few words about China. For the past 70 years, China has been the greatest beneficiary of a supportive regional environment provided by the post-war US-led order. It has fully utilized these favorable conditions to accelerate its rise, facing few obstacles along the way. The free pass is only now starting to be scrutinized more critically. It's increasingly becoming clear that President Xi's Chinese dream is not just a benign construct, but more of a rising power's attempt to impose a hierarchical Asian order which respects China's hegemony, to which countries like Japan and India must reconcile, as Russia has, and the US must accommodate through a preemptive withdrawal from East Asia. Unilateral assertions of core interests are not merely confined to dubious historical claims to the entire South China Sea. These also extend to the economic arena through the unilateral announcement of OBOR, backed by resources of the AIIB. Just for instance, one instance, the China-Pak Industrial Corridor element of OBOR will only deepen India's economic, security, and strategic difficulties in Central and West Asia. And I'd like to point out that I'm here talking about the fact that since we became independent, we've been blocked from access to both these regions as a result of Pakistan. And now, if the advantages are going to be reaped by Pakistan and China, both in terms of security and strategy, then I think we will be left at a greater disadvantage. 2 lines about ASEAN. ASEAN has been the biggest success story of Asian regionalism for the last 50 years. However, as regional disequilibrium accelerates, ASEAN's posture of strategic patience is disconcerting. An ASEAN which is neither cohesive nor quite neutral has been unable to either secure progress on a code of conduct on the South China Sea or to progress an ASEAN-led regional security order. We clearly, from this last summit, which has just ended yesterday, I think that this is a watershed moment for ASEAN. Economically, RCEP is limping along, not the TPP. TPP is already a done deal, even though it took a lot of time. And there are 4 or 5 countries in ASEAN who now want to go on and join the TPP, including Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. So that's a new configuration coming about. And on the South China Sea, it's now become amply clear that China wants a bilateral solution, whereas there are several claimants to South China Sea territories. How is that at all feasible? And secondly, it wants to restrict ASEAN's role to stability, which means keeping control over those ASEAN states which have a stake in the South China Sea. So it's become an unworkable situation. I think it'll probably lead to greater bilateral, trilateral, and other alliance type of arrangements in the region. Conclusions, I have just a few. No, in fact, I have quite a few, sorry. Despite the current slowdown and existing constraints in the global economy, prospects for Asia's economic progress and prosperity remain strong. If there is an overarching concern, it arises from the absence of open and balanced region-wide security architecture to mediate power shifts and uphold a rule-based order. Unlike in West Europe, there is lack of congruence in normative frameworks in Asia, something to which Secretary Srinivasan referred. Plurality of national political systems and differing security perspectives imply that, for the present, security dialogue forums like the EAS will coexist in parallel with bilateral and trilateral security arrangements as well as alliances. It remains to be seen if the region can eventually institutionalize the EAS as a principal leaders-led forum for strategic dialogue, security cooperation, and upholding a normative regional order. The holdouts remain China and Russia, so we really don't know how this will turn out. For India, in one sentence, what we stand for, as far as I can see from all the statements of the government, India supports the orderly rise of a multipolar Asia and strategic equilibrium rooted in the established principles of international law. Now, for the success of China's grand strategies and territorial assertions, I don't think this is merely going to be a function of Chinese national power and resources. It will greatly depend on managing overlapping and sometimes conflicting major power interests successfully and ensuring that benefits are not tilted towards China alone. China can certainly dilute growing concerns about its potential for military coercion by being more circumspect and less aggressive in its posture. If it can show some consideration for Asian multipolarity or the interests of other rising powers, so much the better. For the moment, I believe that the risk of a contended world scenario across the Asia-Pacific remains real and unlikely to dissipate anytime soon. A new Asian great game is truly on. Just as an afterword, and this is, I'm wearing my Japan experience and hat. Over a century ago, Okakura and Tagore heralded Asia's intellectual and political reawakening by declaring Asia as one and the unity of Asian cultures. Problem was that India was not free then, and Japan lost its way thereafter. So there is today a historical resonance in the contemporary efforts of India and Japan to define the contours of this Asian century. The two countries uphold democracy, universal values, and Pacific principles, and for both, their nationalist urges are not based on notions of irredentism and regional dominance. Going forward, the success of the India-Japan Entente will also determine Asia's destiny in this century. Thank you very much.